Every second, your nervous system is hit with millions of bits of sensory information, but your conscious mind is operating through a remarkably narrow bottleneck. In 1956, psychologist George A. Miller mapped this limitation. His research demonstrated that human consciousness can only entertain 7, plus or minus 2, chunks of information at any given time. If you had to use those 7 chunks to consciously maintain your breathing rate, track the temperature of the room, and contract the specific muscles required to keep you upright, your system would instantly overload and crash. To survive this bottleneck, the brain relies on a process called modeling. When you first learn to ride a bicycle or spell a word, the task consumes all your conscious chunks. Over time, the brain sequences those actions and pushes them down into the unconscious. We represent the structure of this unconscious programming as a TOTE loop: test, operate, test, exit. A complex series of physical and mental steps is bundled together and executed automatically as a single block of behavior. By delegating the mechanical execution of life to these unconscious TOTE loops, your brain protects its 7 plus or minus 2 conscious chunks, leaving them free for high-level problem-solving, conversation, and learning. The implication is absolute. The vast bulk of our everyday lives, including our most complex human interactions, consists of nothing more than the automatic execution of these unconscious programs. Look at this portrait of Dr. Milton H. Erickson. In the mid-20th century, Erickson consistently achieved clinical results in psychotherapy that defied traditional explanation, often putting subjects into profound trance states in mere seconds. In one documented instance, an aggressive physician approached Erickson with a bone-crushing handshake to prove he couldn't be hypnotized. Erickson reached out to meet the handshake, but mid-motion, bent down to meticulously tie his own shoe. A handshake is a fully automated TOTE loop. By interrupting the physical action precisely in the middle of the operate phase, Erickson broke the program. The physician was left standing with his arm outstretched, momentarily trapped in a state with no conscious next step, a program null state that made him highly susceptible to an immediate, quiet instruction to go into a trance. Observers often wrote off Erickson's interventions as raw intuition, but Richard Bandler and John Grinder saw a distinct structure. They set out to strip away the mystique and map the exact mechanics of how he manipulated these unconscious programs. Their goal was absolute elegance. They required a model that used the absolute minimum number of mathematical distinctions necessary to systematically replicate Erickson's nonverbal communication. We are going to reconstruct this mathematical model of human trance, building it directly from first principles. To understand communication at this level of precision, we must recognize that human experience at any millisecond can be plotted as a mathematical equation. Look at the 4-tuple, the formal notation for primary sensory experience. Variables track data streams: V for visual, K for kinesthetic, and O for olfactory. Notice the A variable. The subscript T strictly limits auditory to tonal qualities: tempo, pitch, and rhythm. It explicitly excludes the meaning of spoken language. To accurately track human consciousness, the equation requires a second layer identifying exactly where data originates. Look at the superscripts. An E denotes externally generated data, light hitting your retina. An I denotes internally generated data, a recalled memory or internal dialogue. This matrix of variables and superscripts provides a precise geographical map of a subject's attention at any exact moment in time. Discard the theatrical definitions of a hypnotic trance involving swinging pendulums or mind control. Trance induction is simply the mathematically trackable shifting of superscripts from external to internal data. This progression maps the exact sequence. It begins on the left with the waking state, attention heavily on external E variables. In the intermediate stage, visual and kinesthetic variables shift to the internal I state, accessing internal memories. This is partial trance. Notice the auditory tonal variable. Across all phases, the tempo of the hypnotist's voice remains the external anchor, guiding the subject inward. Trance is merely a predictable limitation of the focal point of attention, engineered by systematically altering these sensory variables. The 4-tuple becomes highly volatile when a subject accesses a past memory, because their internal sensory reality suddenly overrides their present physical environment. Here is the final notation added to internal variables, the T/P subscript, tracking specific time and space coordinates. Bandler and Grinder observed a woman whose tonality shifted to a teenager if the therapist raised an eyebrow. The visual trigger activated an internal four-tuple from a different time and space, overriding her physical responses. This reveals the most common point of failure for clinical practitioners. They mistakenly assume the words they speak mean the exact same thing to their client. We represent language with the auditory digital operator, AID. Notice it sits entirely outside the sensory four-tuple. This is a secondary map, a symbolic abstraction that carries none of the sensory data of the territory it describes. When a therapist assumes the linguistic map perfectly represents the underlying sensory reality, they commit an error called complex equivalence. If a client says they want confidence, the therapist has no idea what resources are actually required. For one client, confidence is an internal visual image. For another, it's a highly specific sensation of kinesthetic grounding. This breakdown shows exactly how language operates. The word fire isn't an experience. It is a digital tag assigned to a dense array of specific sensory tuples: the sight of flames, the heat of the smoke, the sound of cracking wood. Standard talk therapy often fails because the clinician spends years attempting to manipulate the linguistic map, while completely ignoring the actual sensory territory dictating the patient's behavior. With the mechanics of the subject mapped, the final component of the model dictates the exact mental configuration required of the clinician. To elicit profound change, the communicator must detect the microscopic, unconscious analog messages from the subject: a shift in breathing rate, changes in muscle tonus, or pupil dilation. To see these signals, the practitioner must adopt a highly disciplined cognitive state known as the Uptime strategy. The client's equation is erratic. Their superscripts shift rapidly between external physical awareness and internal memories or dialogue. The communicator's equation must be entirely rigid. Their four-tuple is locked exclusively to external superscripts, allocating every available unit of attention strictly to sensory data from the room. If a therapist accesses their own internal dialogue to plan what they are going to say next, the strategy breaks. Because of the 7+2 cognitive limit, pulling chunks into internal dialogue instantly blinds the therapist to the external sensory data of the client. They miss the subtle nonverbal cues that are the actual mechanism of change. Erickson's success did not stem from knowing the right words to say. It was a product of his uncompromising, mathematically rigorous observation of his sensory variables happening directly in front of him.